In the movie Scarface, Alejandro Sosa is the ultimate boss. He is the only man who truly scared Tony Montana. With just one calm phone call, he ordered Tony's death. On screen, he had absolute power. But in real life, the actor who played him, Paul Shenar, died completely powerless at age 53. He wasn't taken down by a rival cartel. He was taken down by the AIDS virus and a cold-hearted Hollywood system. The movie studios used him. They forced a dying man to keep playing the invincible bad guy just to make money. And when his body finally gave out, they turned their backs. They used his famous villain image as an excuse to ignore his suffering, erasing his life's work and leaving him to die in total secret. Join us today as we explore the hidden tragedy of Paul Shenar and the dark truth Hollywood tried to bury. Albert Paul Shenar was born on February 12, 1936 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the second of four brothers in a family of Polish and Slovenian descent. The industrial backdrop of the American Midwest offered a predictable path of factory work and quiet domesticity, but Shenar diverted from this expectation early on. He possessed a naturally deep, resonant voice and a commanding physical presence that drew him toward local theater productions. His initial foray into acting was brief, interrupted by military service. He enlisted in the United States Air Force shortly after completing high school, a practical decision that temporarily halted his artistic pursuits, but instilled a rigorous physical discipline. This military background refined his posture and control, traits that would later define his highly structured approach to acting. Following his discharge, Shenar did not return to the industrial life of Milwaukee. He chose the stage, committing himself entirely to the craft. The American theatrical landscape of the late 1950s and early 1960s was heavily influenced by the raw, psychological approach of method acting popularized in New York. Shenar rejected this trend entirely. He favored the rigid, demanding discipline of classical theater. He viewed acting not as an exercise in personal emotional excavation, but as an academic and physical craft requiring perfect diction, immense vocal stamina, and absolute control over movement. He began working through regional circuits, honing his skills in Shakespearean and Greek tragedies. His goal was not celebrity, but mastery of the classical repertoire. By the mid-1960s, Shenar relocated to San Francisco, a city fostering a burgeoning and fiercely independent art scene. Here, he found the environment necessary to build a permanent theatrical institution. He aligned himself with director William Ball, and together with a small group of dedicated actors, they established the American Conservatory Theater. The founding of the American Conservatory Theater marked a pivotal shift in Shenar's trajectory. It was not merely a venue for performances, it was a rigorous training ground and a repertory company designed to rival the great theatrical institutions of Europe. Shenar was one of the original 27 founding members. He threw himself into the company's demanding schedule, which often required actors to rehearse one play during the day while performing another at night. During his tenure in San Francisco, Shenar tackled the most challenging roles in the Western theatrical canon. He took on Hamlet, a role that demanded extraordinary psychological endurance and vocal agility. He performed Oedipus Rex, a masterclass in projecting profound tragedy through classical structure rather than modern melodrama. His performances were noted for their cerebral quality and his imposing baritone voice, which could fill a massive auditorium without the need for electronic amplification. He developed a reputation as a formidable intellectual force within the company, often engaging in deep script analysis and historical research to inform his portrayals. The physical demands of repertory theater were immense. Shenar was performing in dozens of distinct productions over a few short years, oscillating between Shakespeare, Molière, and Chekhov. He cultivated a style that was precise and highly deliberate. Every gesture on stage was calculated. Every pause was timed for maximum impact. He built a professional persona that mirrored his military past. Stoic, prepared, and intensely focused. This period solidified his professional identity. He was a stage actor of the highest caliber, respected by his peers and critics alike for his uncompromising dedication to the classics. He was building a legacy on the boards of San Francisco, far removed from the commercial pressures of the film industry in Los Angeles. Yet, the very skills he perfected during this rigorous period, his chilling stillness, his commanding voice, and his ability to project an aura of absolute authority, were precisely what would eventually draw the attention of television and film executives. The discipline he forged in the theater was preparing him for a transition to the screen, a transition that would bring him global recognition, but ultimately lock him into a devastating typecast. His mastery of classical technique made him stand out, but it also masked the personal complexities he kept carefully hidden from the public eye. As he reached the pinnacle of his stage career, the landscape of American media was shifting, and the lure of broader audiences and substantial financial reward began to pull him away from the Bay Area and toward the camera lens. The transition from the protected, prestigious environment of the American Conservatory Theater to the unforgiving machinery of Los Angeles was a calculated risk. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Paul Shenar had conquered the stage. He had proven his intellectual and physical stamina in the most demanding roles written for the English language. But the stage, for all its artistic purity, offered limited financial security and a restricted audience. Shenar made the pragmatic decision to pack up his life in San Francisco and drive south to Hollywood. He traded the applause of a live audience for the silent, mechanical stare of the camera lens. The culture shock was immediate. In San Francisco, Shenar was a founding member of an elite artistic community. He was a leading man who spent his days dissecting the psychological motivations of kings and tragic heroes. In Los Angeles, he was just another working actor looking for a guest spot on a television procedural. The television landscape of the 1970s was dominated by episodic cop shows, private eye mysteries, and medical dramas. The production schedules were brutal, shooting an entire episode in a matter of days. There was no time for the deep academic script analysis Shenar was accustomed to. Directors did not want philosophical debates about character motivation. They wanted actors to hit their marks, say their lines cleanly, and stay out of the way of the lighting equipment. Shenar adapted, leaning heavily on his military discipline and classical training. He treated these episodic roles with a cold, professional efficiency. Casting directors immediately noticed two things about him. First, his physical stature. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and held himself with an intense, unyielding posture. Second, his voice. In a sea of actors speaking in the flat, casual cadences of 1970s California, Shenar sounded entirely different. His baritone was dark, perfectly enunciated, and carried a natural, almost aristocratic authority. These traits made him highly employable, but they also severely limited his options. Hollywood did not see a versatile Shakespearean actor. They saw a highly effective antagonist. Shenar was quickly slotted into a specific rotation of character types. He was hired to play the corrupt politician, the arrogant foreign dignitary, the cold-hearted businessman, or the sophisticated criminal mastermind. He spent the early part of the decade bouncing from series to series. He appeared in shows like Columbo, Hawaii Five-0, and The Streets of San Francisco. He elevated the material he was given, bringing a chilling stillness to his villains that made them significantly more threatening than the standard television thugs of the era. He rarely raised his voice on screen. He learned early on that true menace on camera comes from stillness, from holding the eyes of the protagonist and delivering a threat with absolute quiet conviction. His first major breakthrough in television required him to portray a man whose ego and vocal power matched his own. In 1975, the American Broadcasting Company produced a made-for-television movie titled The Night That Panicked America. The film dramatized the infamous 1938 radio broadcast of the War of the Worlds, which had famously caused widespread panic across the United States. The producers needed an actor who could believably portray the young Orson Welles. They needed someone who could replicate Welles's booming, hypnotic radio voice, his supreme arrogance, and his sheer physical dominance in a recording studio. Shenar secured the role, and it provided him with the first true opportunity to showcase his theatrical capabilities to a national audience. He did not simply do an impersonation of Orson Welles. He captured the essence of a brilliant, tyrannical artist orchestrating chaos. Shenar's performance anchored the film. He demonstrated how a single man, armed only with a microphone and absolute confidence, could terrorize a nation. The role garnered critical praise and elevated Shenar from a reliable guest star to a highly respected character actor capable of carrying significant historical material. This momentum carried him into the most important cultural event in 1970s American television. In 1977, the miniseries Roots premiered. It was an unprecedented television event, a sprawling multi-generational saga detailing the horrors of American slavery, viewed by tens of millions of people. The casting for Roots was meticulous, drawing on the finest character actors in the industry. Shenar was cast as John Carrington. Carrington was not a one-dimensional monster. The character required a nuanced portrayal of a man participating in a horrific system, rationalizing his actions through the cold lens of commerce. Shenar approached Carrington with the same analytical detachment he had used on stage. He played the role without a trace of mustache-twirling villainy. He portrayed a man executing his business with bureaucratic efficiency, making the character's participation in the slave trade feel chillingly mundane. This performance solidified his reputation in Hollywood. He was the actor you called when you needed a villain who was smart, composed, and terrifyingly competent. While Shenar was building this imposing, authoritative public persona, his private life was a carefully constructed fortress. The reality of his daily existence stood in stark, agonizing contrast to the powerful men he played on screen. Paul Shenar was a gay man navigating an industry and a society that viewed homosexuality with a mixture of hostility, fear, and disgust. In the 1970s, the concept of an openly gay actor maintaining a mainstream career in Hollywood was completely non-existent. The studio system, though fractured from its golden age peak, still enforced rigid moral codes regarding the public images of its stars. The tabloid press was a constant predatory threat. Magazines and gossip columnists thrived on exposing the private lives of public figures. For a working actor, rumors of homosexuality could result in immediate professional exile. Casting directors would suddenly stop calling. Contracts would be quietly dissolved. The public, conditioned by decades of heteronormative media, was presumed to be entirely unwilling to accept a gay man in a position of on-screen authority or romantic lead. Shenar understood these rules implicitly. He had grown up in the conservative Midwest and spent his formative years in the hyper-masculine environment of the 1950s military. He knew how to compartmentalize. He knew how to present a socially acceptable facade. He built a wall between his professional output and his personal truth. He attended industry events, either alone or accompanied by female friends who served as socially acceptable companions, a common survival tactic for closeted actors of the era. He rarely gave interviews about his personal life, deflecting questions with polite intellectual discussions about his acting methodology or the history of the theater. Behind this wall of privacy, Shenar experienced the most significant emotional connection of his life. In the early 1970s, he met the British actor Jeremy Brett. Brett was a force of nature. He was staggeringly handsome, wildly charismatic, and possessed a theatrical pedigree that matched Shenar's own. Brett had trained at the Central School of Speech and Drama in London and had established himself as a brilliant classical actor on the British stage and a striking presence in film, perhaps most notably as Freddie Ainsford Hill in the cinematic adaptation of My Fair Lady. Like Shenar, Brett was a man of intense passion and deep intellect. He was also a man navigating the immense pressures of his own sexuality in a public profession. Their connection was immediate and profound. It was a union of two alphas, two men who completely understood the specific isolating pressures of their shared profession. They shared a devotion to the mechanics of acting, spending hours debating the interpretations of classical texts, the nuances of vocal projection, and the psychological architecture of the characters they played. Friends who knew them during this period described a relationship filled with fierce intellectual sparring, deep mutual respect, and profound affection. But their relationship was forced to exist entirely in the shadows. From roughly 1973 to 1978, Shenar and Brett maintained a transatlantic, highly secretive partnership. The logistics of their romance were exhausting. They could not be photographed together in any context that suggested intimacy. They could not attend public premieres as a couple. They had to maintain separate residences, coordinating their schedules quietly to spend time together behind locked doors in Los Angeles or London. The psychological toll of this enforced secrecy was massive. Both men were fiercely proud and highly accomplished. Yet they were forced to hide the most important aspect of their lives, as if it were a criminal enterprise. They lived with the constant, low-level anxiety of exposure. A wrong word to a journalist, a photograph taken at the wrong moment, or a betrayal by a confidant could instantly destroy the careers they had spent decades building. This environment of fear inevitably poisoned the relationship. The pressure cooker of the closet creates unique fissures in a partnership. The inability to integrate their shared life with their public lives created a suffocating atmosphere. The stress was exacerbated by the geographic distance their careers often demanded, and the intense, sometimes volatile nature of two highly sensitive artistic temperaments clashing in confined spaces. By 1978, the strain became unsustainable. Shenar and Brett made the painful decision to end their romantic relationship. It was not a separation born of a lack of love, but of the crushing external realities of their era. They recognized that the secrecy was destroying them both. Despite the end of the romance, the bond between them remained unbroken. They transitioned from lovers to profound lifelong confidants. They continued to rely on each other for emotional support and professional advice, tied together by a shared history that very few people in the world were permitted to know about. Before he stepped into the role of Alejandro Sosa, Shenar delivered a performance that perfectly encapsulated his unique ability to project menace through sheer vocal power. In 1982, former Disney animator Don Bluth directed an independent animated film titled The Secret of N.I.Osh. The film was dark, visually stunning, and tonally far more mature than the standard animated fare of the time. The narrative required an antagonist who was terrifying, manipulative, and highly intelligent. They needed a voice that could carry the weight of Shakespearean betrayal within the body of an animated rat. They hired Paul Shenar to voice Jenner. Voice acting is a specialized discipline. Without the benefit of physical movement, facial expressions, or lighting, an actor must convey the entirety of a character's internal life solely through the microphone. Shenar's classical training made him perfectly suited for this challenge. He brought the full weight of his stage experience to the recording booth. He did not pitch his voice up or attempt a cartoonish affectation. He played Jenner exactly as he would play a treacherous lord in a royal court. He used precise enunciation to convey Jenner's towering intellect and his contempt for those around him. He used the resonant lower registers of his baritone to project physical threat. The resulting performance is widely considered a masterclass in animation voiceover. Jenner was not just scary, he was dangerously persuasive. He was a villain who believed completely in his own brutal philosophy. The success of The Secret of N.I.M.H. further cemented Shenar's reputation in the casting offices of Los Angeles. Directors and producers recognized that Shenar possessed a rare ability. He could deliver complex, articulate dialogue without sounding theatrical, and he could project an aura of lethal intent without ever raising his fists. He was the sophisticated monster. He was perfectly positioned. He had the resume, the presence, and the voice. He had spent years learning how to navigate the studio system, how to hide his private life, and how to deliver exactly what the camera demanded. In 1982, he was a highly respected, heavily employed character actor entering his late 40s. He had survived the transition from stage to screen. He had survived the heartbreak of a secret relationship. He was standing on the precipice of his greatest professional triumph. The script for a sun-drenched, blood-soaked remake of a classic gangster film was circulating through Hollywood, and the casting director needed someone who could believably terrify Al Pacino. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. The tragedy was about to begin. The year 1983 arrived in Los Angeles with a distinct chaotic energy. The new Hollywood era of the 1970s, defined by gritty, auteur-driven character studies, was dead. In its place stood a decade of excess, neon, and high-concept blockbusters. The cinematic landscape was shifting rapidly toward spectacle. Amidst this cultural pivot, director Brian De Palma and writer Oliver Stone were preparing a massive, bloody, and highly controversial remake of a 1930s gangster classic. They were updating the story of a rising criminal empire, moving the setting from Prohibition-era Chicago to the cocaine-fueled streets of contemporary Miami. The project was Scarface. Al Pacino had already been cast in the lead role of Tony Montana. Pacino was channeling a frenetic, explosive energy for the part, creating a character defined by unchecked ambition, paranoia, and explosive volume. Montana was a blunt instrument. He was a street-level thug who solved problems with a chainsaw and an assault rifle. For the film to work, Montana needed an antagonist who was his exact opposite. The narrative required a villain who operated not on the street, but in the boardroom. They needed a man who represented the globalization of organized crime, someone who viewed the drug trade not as a gang war, but as a multinational corporation. They needed Alejandro Sosa. The casting of Alejandro Sosa was a critical puzzle piece. The character only had a handful of scenes, but his presence had to loom over the entire second half of the film. He had to be entirely believable as the one man on Earth capable of terrifying Tony Montana. De Palma did not want a traditional heavy-set mobster. He wanted sophistication. He wanted aristocracy. He wanted a man who could order a brutal assassination without spilling a drop of his afternoon tea. Paul Shenar walked into the audition room and completely dismantled the competition. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He simply applied the iron discipline of his classical theatrical training to the dialogue Oliver Stone had written. He sat still. He kept his posture rigidly straight, a remnant of his Air Force days. He delivered the lines with a smooth, dark baritone that carried an unmistakable edge of lethal authority. Shenar understood instinctively that Sosa's power did not come from a display of violence, but from the absolute, unwavering certainty that his orders would be carried out. He won the role immediately. The performance he subsequently delivered on set is now studied in film schools as a masterclass in cinematic restraint. Look at the pivotal scenes between Shenar and Pacino. Pacino is constantly moving, sweating, yelling, his eyes darting around the room. Shenar, in stark contrast, barely moves his head. He holds his body perfectly still. His movements are slow and deliberate. He uses his silence as a weapon, forcing Pacino's character to fill the empty air, thereby revealing his own insecurities. Shenar turned Alejandro Sosa into a terrifying figure precisely because he was so civilized. He wore impeccably tailored suits. He spoke of politics and high finance. He was the devil in a bespoke tuxedo, and audiences were completely captivated. When Scarface premiered in December 1983, it was initially met with a barrage of negative reviews from critics who were appalled by its excessive violence and explicit language. But the cultural impact was immediate and undeniable. The film quickly transcended its critical reception to become a massive cultural touchstone. It defined the aesthetics of the 1980s. And in the center of that massive pop culture hurricane was Paul Shenar. At 47 years old, he had finally achieved global cinematic recognition. He was no longer just a respected working actor. He was a recognizable face. The role of Alejandro Sosa permanently altered his career trajectory. His asking price skyrocketed. Scripts began arriving at his door in stacks. Hollywood executives looked at the box office returns and realized they had found their definitive, sophisticated antagonist for the decade. He had reached the absolute peak of his profession. The world was opening up to him. Simultaneously, in the exact same year, his world violently and irreversibly collapsed. Sometime during that monumental year of 1983, away from the premiere parties and the flashbulbs, Shenar sat in a sterile doctor's office and received a death sentence. He was diagnosed with HIV. The historical context of this diagnosis cannot be overstated. In 1983, the medical community was completely entirely in the dark. The virus had only recently been identified. There were no antiretroviral therapies. There was no AZT. There was no cocktail of drugs that could manage the viral load. A positive diagnosis was not a chronic condition. It was a rapid, terrifying, and universally fatal plunge into physical disintegration. Beyond the catastrophic medical reality, the social environment was apocalyptic. The disease was initially and inaccurately branded as a gay plague. It sparked a wave of intense visceral homophobia across the United States. Politicians ignored it, religious leaders framed it as divine retribution. The mainstream press reported on it with a mixture of sensationalism and profound disgust. Men were dying by the thousands in hospital wards, entirely abandoned by their families, while the broader public looked on with indifference or open hostility. For a man in Shenar's position, the diagnosis was a dual tragedy. It was a guarantee of a painful, premature physical death, and it was a guarantee of immediate professional annihilation. Hollywood in the early 1980s operated on a foundation of ruthless pragmatism masked by public relations. The studio system was terrified of the new virus. They were not driven by moral panic, but by financial liability. A film production is a multi-million-dollar investment. The entire apparatus relies on the lead actors showing up to set every single day, healthy and ready to work. If an actor fell ill midway through a shoot, the production would shut down, costing the studio fortunes. Consequently, a vicious, paranoid whisper network developed within the industry. Casting directors, producers, and agents traded rumors over lunches and phone calls. If a male actor, particularly a single middle-aged male actor who was known or suspected to be gay, began looking too thin or developed a sudden, unexplained cough, the machinery of Hollywood simply stopped engaging with him. He would not be fired. He would just never be hired again. He would become uninsurable. Shenar was acutely aware of this brutal reality. He had spent decades carefully constructing a public facade, hiding his sexuality to maintain his career. Now that same career depended on hiding a terminal illness. He made the only choice available to a man who refused to be discarded. He decided to fight a silent war. He told almost no one. He swore his doctors to secrecy. He locked the truth of his decaying immune system behind the same iron discipline he used to build his characters on stage. This decision initiated what can only be described as a grueling, unspoken slave contract with the industry. The terms of this contract were not written on paper. They were enforced by the sheer terror of losing everything. Shenar had to keep working. The financial imperative was massive. While there were no cures, there was a black market of experimental, highly expensive, and often entirely ineffective treatments emerging. He needed capital to fight the virus, and his only source of capital was his ability to project physical dominance on screen. Furthermore, he had to work to maintain the illusion of health. If he took a year off, the rumors would start. The silence would be interpreted as a deathbed vigil. He had to remain visible. He had to remain imposing. The irony was savage. Just as his body began the slow, microscopic process of betrayal, Hollywood demanded that he exploit his physical presence more than ever before. He was trapped in the success of Scarface. The studios did not want him for quiet, cerebral dramas. They wanted Alejandro Sosa. They wanted the cold stare, the broad shoulders, the deep voice, and the aura of invincibility. They cast him in a relentless string of action films, crime thrillers, and intense television movies. He was thrown into demanding shooting schedules, working long hours under hot studio lights or on location in physically draining environments. He was required to hit his marks, deliver his lines with booming authority, and project a terrifying vitality while his own T-cell count was plummeting. He was essentially performing two roles simultaneously. On camera, he was playing the ruthless kingpin, the corrupt official, the untouchable master of the universe. Off camera, the moment the director yelled cut, he was playing the role of a healthy, thriving actor, hiding his exhaustion, masking his symptoms, and smiling through the creeping terror of a terminal decline. It was an astonishing feat of endurance, driven by pride, fear, and a desperate, clinging need to remain relevant in an industry that would erase him the moment it discovered his secret. The man who portrayed the most powerful figures in cinema had become a complete prisoner to his own success, forced to dance for the cameras while the clock ran out on his life. The physical destruction of Paul Shenar's body was a slow, agonizing process, but the psychological devastation had been institutionalized decades earlier. Long before the virus attacked his immune system, a deeply prejudiced society had already mandated the suppression of his true identity. The tragedy of his final years was not merely medical. It was the catastrophic collision of a terminal illness with a lifetime of enforced silence. Behind the imposing baritone, behind the rigid posture and the terrifying gaze of Alejandro Sosa, Shenar was a man locked in a brutal psychological cage. He was a gay man navigating the absolute peak of American masculinity in the 20th century. The entertainment industry sold a highly specific, uncompromising vision of manhood. Leading men were stoic, heterosexual conquerors. Villains were ruthless, calculating predators. There was zero margin for deviation. In the 1970s, the Hollywood closet was not a metaphor. It was a highly organized, punitive system of control. The major studios maintained an unofficial, but entirely effective blacklist for anyone suspected of moral turpitude. The tabloid press operated with predatory viciousness. Journalists routinely bribed hotel staff, tracked license plates, and cultivated networks of informants just to catch a glimpse of an actor slipping into a gay bar or a private residence. Exposure meant instant professional death. Morality clauses were weaponized. Contracts would vanish overnight. A career built on decades of classical training and grueling stage work could be obliterated by a single photograph. Shenar knew the rules of this lethal game. He played it with the same cold efficiency he brought to his stage roles. He compartmentalized his existence. He constructed a public persona that was unassailable. He attended industry functions with carefully selected female companions. He deflected personal questions during the interviews with dense intellectual discourses on theatrical technique. He weaponized his imposing physical stature and his deep voice to project an aura of aggressive heterosexuality, entirely preempting any suspicion from casting directors or producers. It was a brilliant performance. It was also a form of psychological torture. The constant hypervigilance required to monitor every word, every gesture, and every glance in public exacted a massive toll. He was living a spy's existence in his own life. This suffocating environment makes the central romance of his life both profoundly beautiful and utterly heartbreaking. In the early 1970s, the walls Shenar had so carefully constructed were breached by an equal force. He met Jeremy Brett. Brett was a titan of the British stage. He possessed an aristocratic bearing, a razor-sharp intellect, and a classical pedigree that mirrored Shenar's own. He was educated at Eton. He trained at the Central School of Speech and Drama in London. He had already achieved international recognition for his striking, charismatic presence in films like My Fair Lady. He would later achieve global immortality as the definitive television incarnation of Sherlock Holmes. Like Shenar, Brett was a man of immense talent and deep contradictions. He was navigating the treacherous waters of his own sexuality in an equally unforgiving British press environment. When they met, the attraction was immediate, electrical. and entirely mutual. It was not a superficial Hollywood fling. It was a collision of two intellectual heavyweights. They recognized in each other the exact same artistic obsession and the exact same private agony. They were two men who had dedicated their lives to the forensic examination of human emotion on stage, yet were forbidden from expressing their own fundamental truths in the sunlight. From roughly 1973 to 1978, Shenar and Brett forged a deeply passionate, intensely private life together. The logistics of their relationship required military precision. They could never be seen arriving at the same location together. They maintained separate public residences. Their time together was spent behind heavy curtains and locked doors in Los Angeles, New York, or London. Within those hidden spaces, they found absolute sanctuary. Friends who were permitted inside their inner circle described a relationship of staggering intensity. They were not just lovers, they were sparring partners. They spent hours dissecting Shakespearean monologues, arguing over the psychological motivations of obscure characters, and pushing each other to greater artistic heights. They provided each other with the one thing neither could find anywhere else, a space where the mask could finally be dropped. But a relationship built entirely in the shadows is inherently unstable. The pressure cooker of the 1970s closet began to crush them. The strain of constant deception was corrosive. The geographical distance dictated by their respective careers forced them into long periods of separation, amplifying the anxiety and paranoia. They were two highly sensitive, intensely proud artists forced to behave like fugitives. The inability to integrate their profound love into their daily public lives created a deep, festering resentment, not toward each other, but toward the world that demanded their invisibility. By 1978, the weight of the secrecy broke the romantic foundation of the partnership. The separation was devastating for both men. They ended the romance, but they absolutely refused to end the bond. The physical relationship ceased, but the intellectual and emotional tether remained entirely intact. They transitioned into profound, lifelong confidants. Brett remained one of the very few people on Earth who truly knew the man behind Paul Shenar's imposing facade. When the 1980s arrived, bringing with it the catastrophic wave of the AIDS epidemic, Shenar faced the nightmare alone. The double tragedy of his final years crystallized in the aftermath of his HIV diagnosis. He was handed a terminal sentence for a disease that the world viewed with open disgust. The virus was explicitly linked to the very identity he had spent his entire life hiding. If he had been diagnosed with cancer, he would have received an outpouring of industry support. Colleagues would have rallied, fundraisers would have been organized, he would have been permitted the dignity of public suffering. But HIV demanded silence. The cruelest aspect of this silence was the severance from his support network. He could not turn to the public. He could not turn to the studios. And, out of a desperate desire to protect the people he loved from the agonizing reality of his decline, he largely isolated himself from his closest friends. He was trapped. He was dying of a disease associated with the gay community, yet he was entirely cut off from the solidarity and fierce activism that was beginning to form within that community. He was a wealthy, successful actor who could not buy his way out of the stigma. He was forced to rely on the one survival mechanism he had perfected over a lifetime. He acted. The survival tactic Shenar mastered during his hidden years in the 1970s became his primary defense mechanism a decade later. He repurposed his classical technique into a daily survival tool. His rigid, disciplined posture now served a grim new purpose, disguising severe muscle depletion. He forced his trademark baritone out of a failing respiratory system, projecting an illusion of aggressive vitality to the cameras. He walked onto active sets, hit his marks flawlessly, and played untouchable kings of crime. Every take was a physical lie, masking the reality of a body in active revolt. The enforced isolation of his past now dictated his tragic present. The unwritten industry rules that once kept his relationship with Jeremy Brett locked away now guaranteed he would face a lethal illness without a public safety net. There was no partner waiting in the wings. There was no confidant to help navigate the terrifying maze of experimental treatments or the sheer panic of the prognosis. Hollywood had built a machine that demanded his absolute silence. Surrounded by hundreds of crew members, blinding studio lights, and the constant noise of production, Shenar fought a completely solitary war. The second half of the 1980s created a paradox in the life of Paul Shenar. It was a dichotomy so extreme, it borders on the absurd. By 1986, Alejandro Sosa was firmly cemented in the public consciousness as the ultimate architect of cinematic violence. He was the apex predator of the 1980s crime genre. The brilliance of Shenar's performance in Scarface lay entirely in his physical economy. Sosa never raised a weapon. He never engaged in a physical altercation. His power was absolute because it was entirely delegated. In the film's climax, while Tony Montana is violently disintegrating in a hail of bullets and cocaine psychosis, Sosa sits thousands of miles away. He holds a telephone. He speaks in a calm, measured tone. He orchestrates a massacre without raising his heart rate or wrinkling his linen suit. He possesses total autonomy. He controls his environment, his enemies, and his own physiological responses. He is the master of his domain. The man playing him had lost control of everything. While audiences watched Sosa dictate the terms of life and death on cable television and VHS rentals, Paul Shenar was rapidly losing the ability to dictate the terms of his own biology. The HIV virus does not announce itself with dramatic violence. It works with cold, microscopic efficiency. It dismantles the immune system piece by piece. It destroys the body's internal security apparatus, leaving the door wide open for opportunistic infections that a healthy body would effortlessly repel. For an actor whose entire livelihood depended on physical discipline, this loss of autonomy was the ultimate terror. Shenar had spent his entire adult life mastering his physical vessel. He had trained his diaphragm to project Shakespearean dialogue to the back rows of massive theaters. He had trained his posture to convey military authority and aristocratic arrogance. His body was his instrument, his tool, and his livelihood. Now that instrument was turning against him. The physical manifestations of the disease in the mid-1980s were brutal and highly visible. Patients experienced sudden catastrophic weight loss. They suffered from drenching night sweats and chronic exhausting fevers. The skin, the actor's most crucial canvas, became vulnerable to lesions and discoloration. The energy required to simply walk across a room could suddenly vanish, replaced by a bone-deep, crushing fatigue. Shenar was acutely aware of every single microscopic failure within his body, but he could not afford the luxury of being a patient. A patient is allowed to rest. A patient is allowed to look weak. A patient receives care. Shenar had to be a working Hollywood actor. He was trapped in an industry that evaluated human beings entirely on their physical viability and commercial appeal. The studio system of the late 1980s was a machine running on enormous financial margins. Casting directors and producers were not social workers. They were risk assessors. If an actor looked tired, if he looked gaunt, or if he showed any sign of the physical frailty associated with the rapidly spreading AIDS epidemic, he became a financial liability. He became uninsurable. The offers would stop. The career would end. This environment forced Shenar into the most demanding and terrifying performances of his entire life. These performances did not happen on film sets. They happened in casting offices, in executive boardrooms, and in highly lit Hollywood restaurants. Every time Shenar left his home to secure a role, he had to meticulously assemble the illusion of perfect health. He used his classical theater training not to win awards, but to secure basic survival. He knew exactly what the producers expected. They expected the man who killed Tony Montana. They expected strength, vitality, and menace. He had to deliver that expectation while fighting an internal war. If he was running a fever, he had to suppress the shivers. If he was suffering from joint pain, he had to walk into the executive suite with a long, confident, aggressive stride. He had to shake hands with a firm, crushing grip to dispel any rumors of weakness. He had to use the deep, resonant lower registers of his baritone voice to project an aura of absolute command, carefully hiding the shortness of breath that often accompanied his failing immune system. He was acting for his life. He was weaponizing his own legendary stage technique to deceive the very people who employed him. The psychological toll of this constant, high-stakes deception was immeasurable. He was living in a state of perpetual hypervigilance. He had to monitor the lighting in a room to ensure it did not highlight the hollowness of his cheeks. He had to carefully select his wardrobe, utilizing tailored suits and layered clothing to disguise the rapid loss of muscle mass. He was playing a character called Paul Shenar, healthy Hollywood character actor, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was no director to call cut. There was no dressing room where he could drop the facade, except the absolute isolation of his own home. You can see the strain of this agonizing double life if you look closely at his filmography from 1986 to 1988. He worked relentlessly. He appeared in Raw Deal, standing toe-to-toe with Arnold Schwarzenegger. He took on a prominent role in Curtis Hanson's stylish thriller, The Bedroom Window. He appeared alongside James Woods in Bestseller. He traveled to Europe to shoot Luc Besson's visually stunning underwater epic, The Big Blue. The studios kept hiring him to play sophisticated, powerful men. He played mobsters, corrupt officials, and wealthy antagonists. He delivered exactly what was required. He hit his marks. He delivered the dialogue with his trademark chilling precision. He maintained his professional reputation as a reliable, highly effective character actor. But beneath the surface of these performances, the physical reality was bleeding through. The broad shoulders were sharp beneath the tailored jackets. The face was drawn. The imposing physical bulk that had defined his earlier career was gradually being replaced by a stark, skeletal intensity. He was burning his own physiological reserves to keep the cameras rolling. He was cannibalizing his own life force to maintain his commercial value. This desperate fight for survival birthed one of the most tragic visual ironies in cinematic history. In Scarface, Alejandro Sosa is rarely seen without his signature oversized dark sunglasses. In the context of the film, they are a prop of intimidation. They are a barrier. They prevent other characters from reading his eyes. shielding his intentions and projecting an aura of cool, impenetrable authority. They are the ultimate accessory of a man who has nothing to hide, but refuses to let you see him anyway. In the final years of his life, Paul Shenar adopted oversized dark sunglasses as a permanent fixture of his off-screen wardrobe. He wore them to industry lunches. He wore them during script readings. He wore them while walking from his car to the studio gates. But they were no longer a prop of intimidation. They were a desperate medical shield. The virus and the subsequent physical decline took a heavy toll on his face. The eyes, the most expressive and vital tool for any actor, often betrayed his true condition. They were sunken into his skull. They were frequently clouded with exhaustion or yellowed from the heavy experimental medications he was forced to take in secret. The sunglasses hid the physical evidence of his mortality. They hid the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man watching his own body disintegrate. He took the symbol of his greatest on-screen triumph and repurposed it to hide his greatest real-world vulnerability. He used the iconography of the billionaire drug lord to mask the profound helplessness of the AIDS patient. It was a brilliant, devastating tactical maneuver. People saw the glasses and they did not see a dying man. They saw the Hollywood villain. They saw Alejandro Sosa. Shenar leaned into the typecast to protect his secret. He allowed the industry to project their cinematic fantasies onto him, because the alternative was immediate erasure. He knew that if he took the glasses off, if he allowed the Hollywood executives to see the hollow, exhausted eyes of a man dying of a highly stigmatized disease, they would not offer him sympathy. They would offer him the door. They would revoke his access to the only world he had ever known. They would strip him of his livelihood, his health insurance, and his dignity. So he kept the glasses on. He kept his back straight. He kept his voice low and commanding. He walked onto film sets and played men of supreme power, knowing with absolute certainty that the moment the production wrapped, he would return to an empty house to face a relentless, invisible executioner, completely alone. He fought a quiet, brutal war of attrition against an industry that valued his on-screen menace infinitely more than his off-screen humanity. He refused to let them see him break. He maintained the facade of the untouchable kingpin right up until his physical form simply could no longer support the weight of the lie. The late 1980s brought a grim new reality to the entertainment industry. The whisper networks surrounding the AIDS epidemic had evolved into a deafening, inescapable roar. The virus was no longer a distant rumor confined to marginalized communities. It was actively decimating the creative class of Los Angeles and New York. Actors, directors, casting agents, and makeup artists were vanishing from sets and reappearing in obituaries. Hollywood was forced to react. The reaction exposed the absolute moral bankruptcy of the studio system. When a prominent public figure contracted the virus, the industry apparatus categorized them. They did not categorize them by their medical needs. They categorized them by their public relations value. The treatment an actor received upon diagnosis depended entirely on the demographic they appealed to and the type of characters they played on screen. This created a sickening phenomenon. We can call it the death cast. The public and the media in the 1980s possessed a profound inability to separate actors from their cinematic personas. The roles a person played dictated the level of empathy they were afforded in real life. Consider the case of Rock Hudson. When Hudson's diagnosis became public knowledge in 1985, the cultural shockwave was massive. Hudson was the quintessential American leading man. He was the ruggedly handsome, fiercely heterosexual romantic hero of the 1950s and 1960s. He starred opposite Doris Day. He represented a safe, sanitized, mid-century ideal of masculinity. When the public learned that their romantic hero was a gay man dying of AIDS, the cognitive dissonance was staggering. The narrative immediately shifted to one of tragic irony. The industry rallied. Elizabeth Taylor mobilized her immense star power to launch massive fundraising campaigns. The media covered his decline with a morbid but undeniable sense of tragedy. He was given the dignity of being a victim. Paul Shenar was afforded no such dignity. Shenar did not play romantic leads. He did not represent the wholesome American ideal. He played foreign drug lords. He played corrupt bureaucrats. He played men who smuggled narcotics, ordered assassinations, and operated entirely outside the bounds of civilized morality. He was the sophisticated face of cinematic evil. When the undeniable physical signs of his illness began to break through his carefully constructed facade, the industry machinery calculated his worth and found him entirely expendable. The rationale was insidious. In the warped moral calculus of 1980s, AIDS was heavily stigmatized as a disease of consequence. It was widely, incorrectly viewed as a punishment for a deviant lifestyle. The media routinely conflated the virus with the criminal underworld, drug abuse, and societal decay. Shenar was famous for playing the architects of that exact decay. He was Alejandro Sosa. He was the man flooding the streets with cocaine. Therefore, when the man who played the drug lord contracted the stigmatized virus, it did not cause a public rupture in the way Rock Hudson's diagnosis had. It fit a dark, subconscious prejudice. The public and the press were completely conditioned to expect a grim, inevitable demise for the character Shenar portrayed. When that demise manifested in the actor's real life, it was met with a chilling collective shrug. The reaction of the Hollywood establishment was a masterclass in absolute coldness. There were no press conferences to address his declining health. There were no celebrity-studded galas organized to help cover his mounting medical debts. The major studios, the very entities that had profited massively from his terrifying screen presence, simply stopped calling his agent. They instituted a policy of silent erasure. When a leading man gets sick, the studio protects the investment. When the villain gets sick, the studio replaces the part. The executives who had eagerly shaken Shenar's hand at the Scarface premiere now actively avoided him at industry functions. The producers who had praised his commanding baritone now whispered about his gaunt appearance behind closed doors. They watched him struggle to maintain his physical stature. They watched his face hollow out, and they offered nothing but the silent treatment. This was not merely an absence of charity, it was an active, punitive isolation. The industry isolated him because acknowledging his humanity would require acknowledging their own complicity in the stigma. If they admitted that Paul Shenar, the brilliant, classically trained founder of the American Conservatory Theater, was dying a brutal death, they would have to face the reality of the epidemic. It was far easier to let him fade away in the shadows. It was easier to pretend that the villain was simply meeting his scripted end. He was dying the exact way his characters died. He was dying discarded, defeated, and entirely stripped of his power. But unlike a cinematic death, there was no dramatic final monologue. There was no orchestral swell. There was only the quiet, agonizing reality of a failing body in an empty room. The men he played on screen were brought down by rival cartels or heroic police officers. Shenar was brought down by a collapsing immune system and the staggering cowardice of his peers. The men and women he had worked alongside for decades, the actors he had trained with, the directors he had elevated with his performances, largely stayed away. The fear of association was too great. In an industry built entirely on perception, proximity to a dying AIDS patient was considered a lethal career risk. He was left to navigate the final, terrifying stages of his illness with only a very small, fiercely guarded circle of confidants. The vast majority of the public, the millions of people who had been thrilled and terrified by his performances, had absolutely no idea he was fighting for his life. The media apparatus that normally tracks the every movement of Hollywood stars completely ignored his decline. They denied him the right to be a human being. They demanded he remain the monster they hired him to be right up until the moment he stopped breathing. He was entirely consumed by the persona he had created to survive. The absolute coldness of the industry ensured that his suffering remained entirely invisible, paving the way for the final, devastating act of erasure that would follow his passing. On October 11, 1989, the man who brought Alejandro Sosa to life died in West Hollywood. He was 53 years old. He had fought a 6-year war on two fronts, against a virus dismantling his body and against the relentless prejudice of his own industry. His end was quiet. There were no red carpets. There were no sprawling obituaries in the trade papers. There were no public tears from the executives who had profited immensely from his talent. He was cremated in silence. His ashes were entrusted to his executor, Thomas Wiley. Then the act of erasure began. The cruelty of Hollywood did not stop at his grave. The industry used its media power to scrub his legacy. The very institutions he helped build turned their backs. The American Conservatory Theater quietly minimized his foundational role for years. The stigma of the virus was so potent that the elite circles of the art world feared the phrase AIDS patient would tarnish their prestige and alienate their donors. Paul Shenar was squeezed for his commercial value while he breathed and systematically stripped of his dignity the moment he stopped. The true killer in this tragedy was not just a virus. It was a Hollywood system that utilized deceit and rigid prejudice to bury an artistic titan. When you watch his films today, look past the cinematic villain. See the sheer will of an artist practicing his craft under impossible duress. See the classical master who used his talent to wear an unbreakable mask while crumbling inside. His true legacy is not that he played the perfect bad guy. His legacy is that he maintained his absolute dignity in an era that tried desperately to destroy it. He did not just die of a disease, he died of silence. It is time we finally broke it.